They thought they could just toss me aside after 12 years, like I was some piece of outdated equipment they could swap out for a newer model. That alone should have told me everything, but I was running late for a classified briefing with Pentagon brass, and when you're managing security on a $28 million defense contract, you don't pause for warning signs from former Navy buddies in expensive Italian shoes. Logan's whole vibe felt wrong that Tuesday morning when I walked past the server room. Like static interference on a clear radio channel, something was off in his frequency, the way he carried himself. I'd served with the guy on the USS Constellation. You learn to read people's signals when your life depends on it. Name's Hunter Richardson. Mac to anyone who's worked with me, 47 years old, and I've been hardening computer networks since before these MBA kids knew what a firewall was. Built my whole career on one simple principle. If you control the infrastructure, you control everything. Still, I logged the deviation in my mental notes. That twitchy energy Logan was broadcasting, the kind men get when they've confused betrayal for business strategy. 12 years, I'd been running security operations for this company. 12 years. I joined Defense Grid Systems when it was 3 ex-Navy guys sharing a cramped office with a cryptocurrency startup that got hacked out of existence 6 weeks later. I wrote our first intrusion detection system on my personal computer. I configured the initial Pentagon security protocols for my garage, while my wife was asking why I was spending weekends playing with computers instead of fixing the leaky faucet. I didn't wear expensive suits or quote Harvard Business Review. I built the backbone of this network while Logan was optimizing his LinkedIn profile every quarter like it was going to make him rich. If you've been following these stories and want more like this, it really helps when you hit that subscribe button. 97% of people never do, but it's what keeps these stories coming. So thanks for actually listening. Anyway, I didn't start this story to brag about my credentials. I'm not good at selling myself. I'm good at remembering details. Like remembering how back in 2015, Logan nearly wrote me out of our first major Pentagon contract. Said I was too technical to justify executive-level compensation. I didn't fight him then. I wrote Clause 15A instead. Quietly, real quietly. No one paid attention to the implementation. Not even our legal team, who were too busy kissing up to the lead contractor. Clause 15A, executive equity accelerates at full contract value if any security clearance changes or foreign involvement happens without both parties agreeing in writing. That clause was my insurance policy, my kill switch, and my retirement plan rolled into one clean sentence. Logan had just triggered it without bothering to read the fine print. But let me back up the timeline a bit. Before the clause activated, before Preston showed up, before the whole mess exploded, it started 2 weeks ago. Logan strolled into my workspace with a coffee mug that said Synergize Success, which told me everything I needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. We're thinking about modernizing our command structure, he said, in that chirpy way that sounds like he's reading from a corporate training manual. Strategic realignment. Streamlined hierarchies. I stopped what I was doing and really looked at him. You want me to write my own termination procedures? He laughed like I was making a joke. I wasn't. No, he said. Just a transition document. Best practices, you know where the access codes are stored, who handles contract renewals, what systems we use for Pentagon oversight. That kind of thing. The kind of thing only someone with complete administrative control would know. I told him I'd have it ready by Friday. Then I spent 3 hours reviewing my original employment agreement, which I'd printed and stored in a fireproof safe next to my discharge papers from the Navy. Clause 15A stared back at me like a loaded gun with the safety off. My wife found me in the garage that night, reading contract language by the workbench light. "You okay, Mac?" she asked. The way wives do when they know something's wrong but don't want to pry. "Just double-checking some paperwork," I told her. She kissed the top of my head and went back inside. 20 years of marriage, and she still trusted me to handle business without dragging her into the technical details. I drafted the transition document with surgical precision. Every access point, every renewal schedule, every contract clause and vendor contact. Then I added something extra, a little section labeled Provisional Authority Dependencies with just enough complexity to make any lawyer's head spin. Before sending it, I copied everything to my personal server, then I hit send. They thought they were setting up a smooth leadership transition. I was setting up a tripwire. Logan didn't say the actual words at first. That would have required actual backbone. Instead, He floated them in standard corporate speak, dropping phrases like succession planning and next-generation leadership, like they were harmless configuration updates. We were right in the middle of deploying the federal security upgrade, so I figured it was just his usual caffeine-fueled delusions of corporate grandeur. But then, real quietly, a calendar notification landed in my inbox. Subject line, transition briefing, ops ownership. Addressed only to me, no backup recipients, just one line in the message body. Hi, can you outline everything you handle on the operations side? Full technical stack, all vendors, active contracts, renewal dates, compliance requirements, and where the security credentials are stored. Trying to map out the complete network topology. The way you map a system before you tear it down and rebuild it. I replied, sure, I'll put together the documentation, but in the background, I started gathering my evidence files, 12 years of evidence files. Vendor contracts with my signature multi-factor authentication setups tied to my clearance, certificate renewals that routed through my personal credentials. I had a master database I called Pulse, and they didn't even know it existed. I updated it religiously every month. Not because I was paranoid, because I was prepared. Logan thought he was executing quiet succession planning. What he was actually doing was stepping into a minefield I'd been laying since 2015. Right after the same Pentagon officials who praised my security architecture tried to reassign me before our Phase 2 implementation. That's when I learned to write contracts like they were weapons. You don't win corporate wars with good intentions and hard work. You win them with bulletproof documentation and the patience to wait for the right moment. Clause 15A wasn't a bluff. It was buried deep in the Second Amendment to my executive agreement, right under a paragraph about stock vesting schedules that would put most people to sleep. I'd slipped it in when our legal team was too distracted arguing over Logan's founder equity terms. The language was surgical. Full value acceleration triggered by any security clearance modification, organizational restructuring, or foreign entity involvement not explicitly agreed to in writing by both parties. I reviewed that clause 3 times that night, then pulled the signed original out of my home safe and scanned a clean copy to my secure email account. Tom stamped. Then I made sure the hard copy was stored behind my Navy commendation certificates, where I'd be sure to find it again. When I compiled the transition document, I made it perfect. Brutally comprehensive. Every system component they didn't understand, every dependency they'd trip over if they tried to proceed without me. And at the bottom of page 6, I added one final line. All systems listed require direct executive-level authorization to modify without risking critical infrastructure failure. Translation: fire me and watch the network crash. I hit send and then I waited, not worried, just prepared. Because if Logan was going to feed me to the next golden boy in line, he was going to choke on the technical documentation first. The betrayal happened in slow motion, but it hit like a cyber attack. Monday morning, 8:32 a.m., right on schedule. I was finishing up a deployment status report when my office door swung open walked Logan, grinning like he'd just landed another government contract. Behind him came Preston, maybe 28 years old, with the confident energy of a man who thinks expensive wireless earbuds make him a technology expert. Designer sunglasses still on indoors. In my office, Logan didn't even try to ease into it. Just walked right up and dropped the news like he was announcing a software update. Preston's going to be leading operations now, he said, slapping me on the shoulder like we were old fishing buddies. You'll support him, of course. Maybe stay on as a technical advisor. A technical advisor to Preston. I turned slowly in my chair and looked Logan straight in the eye. That smile of his had layers. Fake warmth on top, patronizing confidence in the middle, and underneath it all, a flicker of anticipation, like he expected me to break down or start begging for my job. I appreciate the status update, I said, keeping my voice flat as a baseline reading. I smiled back at him, just a little, just enough to make him wonder what I was thinking. I didn't panic. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't even ask why. I just closed my laptop, stood up, and walked out of the room, quietly. Behind me, I heard Preston say something to Logan about getting up to speed on the technical infrastructure. Good luck with that, kid. The next morning, I found Preston hanging around outside the server room, poking at his phone like it was supposed to unlock classified systems through sheer proximity. He looked up when I approached, eyes wide like he was about to ask me to troubleshoot his home Wi-Fi. So, he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice pitching up slightly, ready to show me how this whole network operates. I stopped just short of the access panel and let the silence stretch between us. Then I smiled, small, precise, surgical. "No," I said. "I'm here to observe what breaks down." His confident expression hung in the air for a beat too long before it crumbled. He didn't know the passwords. He didn't know the legacy security protocols or the redundancy systems or what would happen if he approved a certificate change during an active Pentagon deployment. He didn't even know that most of our government interface credentials were still routed through authentication servers registered under my security clearance. All he knew was what Logan had told him, that he was in charge now. What Logan hadn't mentioned, what nobody had explained to this kid, was that authority without understanding is just a fancy title on a business card. And Preston had just walked into that reality wearing 300 Naughter sneakers and a vest from Patagonia. I walked past him, keyed into the server room, and left the door open behind me. He didn't follow, smart kid. Actually, let the silence teach him something Harvard Business School never covered. I wasn't planning to sabotage anything, didn't need to. Physics would handle the rest. At 1:04 p.m. that same day, my attorney hand-delivered a package to Defense Grid's front desk. Certified mail, encrypted, time-stamped. Inside was a 4-page notification addressed to the company's general counsel, outlining a material unilateral role modification in violation of executive agreement terms. Legal language, sure, but the kind that sticks like malware when you read it twice. By 1:36 p.m., I was monitoring the company's Slack channels, the ones I still had access to minus in watching the digital panic spread. Legal pinged HR, HR pinged Logan. I didn't have clearance for their executive channels anymore, but I had monitoring capabilities in several subsystems they'd forgotten to revoke. Old communication threads, archived channels, backdoors nobody remembered to close. I didn't respond to any of it. Didn't need to. The documentation my attorney delivered was comprehensive enough to speak for itself. First, a printed copy of my signed equity agreement from 2015 with Logan's signature on every page. Then, a highlighted summary of Clause 15A. Executive equity accelerates at highest recorded contract valuation if any security clearance modification or foreign entity involvement occurs without mutual written consent. The attachments were even better. A PDF of Logan's transition document request, complete with metadata showing timestamp and origin. The updated organizational chart that stripped me of all direct reports. An audio transcript of Monday morning's office handoff to Preston. A detailed comparison of my previous operational responsibilities versus my newly assigned advisory role. By 2 p.m., Defense Grid's general counsel had read through everything twice and forwarded the entire package to the board of directors with a subject line that simply read, "Urge Clause 15A executive equity violation." That's when the real system failure began. See, I wasn't just some senior IT guy they could shuffle around like office furniture. I was an executive stakeholder on paper, on record, with contractual rights they'd apparently forgotten about when they drew up their little succession plan. They thought demoting me from operations director to technical advisor was just a polite reorganization. They thought the word advisor would make the whole thing sound collaborative and professional. What they didn't realize was that demoting an executive during an active Pentagon deployment quarter without signed mutual agreement was like detonating a logic bomb in a production environment. And Clause 15A was the explosive device they'd just armed with their corporate restructuring. Preston was still clueless about why his system access was so limited. He thought it was a permissions glitch, something that would get resolved once IT updated his user profile. I heard from one of the network engineers that Preston spent most of that afternoon trying to figure out why he couldn't access the core infrastructure management tools. Logan, meanwhile, had gone completely silent, radio dark, the kind of quiet you only get when someone realizes they've just made a career-ending mistake, and they're trying to figure out how to undo it without admitting they screwed up in the first place. The board had already approved the organizational changes. It was official, documented, filed with HR, and shared with Pentagon contract oversight. A done deal. They'd pulled the trigger on their little management shuffle without realizing it was wired to a financial explosive device. And now they had exactly 30 calendar days to figure out how to explain to their investors and Pentagon liaisons why they owed me more than $8 million because they wanted me to train a kid who probably couldn't spell cybersecurity without autocorrect. You build your reputation quietly for 12 years. They call it loyalty. You cash in on it through one legal clause. They call it extortion. The call came Thursday morning at 10:17 a.m. I was at home in my workshop, adjusting the frequency on my ham radio setup, when my phone buzzed with a number I recognized but hadn't seen in years. Defense Grid's outside legal counsel. Not some junior associate either. This was Owen Bradley himself, the heavy hitter they brought in when lawsuits got serious or investors got nervous. The same guy who toasted my Pentagon security clearance at the company holiday party back in 2018 with a $400 bottle of bourbon and told me, "You're the foundation of this whole operation, Mac." Don't ever forget that. Apparently, foundations had gotten too expensive. I let it ring twice, picked up on the third ring. "Morning, Mac." He started, trying his best to sound casual and friendly. "We've all been a little caught off guard by how things developed this week. Logan speaks very highly of you, always has. We were hoping we could work out some kind of arrangement that benefits everyone involved." I didn't say anything, just listened while I fine-tuned the radio antenna, let him fill the silence. "Look, we understand there's been some contractual language triggered," he continued, choosing each word like it might explode if he said it wrong. "But maybe there's a way to handle this that doesn't result in immediate financial pressure on the company. Maybe we could restructure your equity into a deferred compensation plan, add some consulting fees to ease the transition, include a mutual non-disclosure agreement to keep things professional." There it was, the ask. They wanted me to take a smaller payout over time, sign away my right to talk about what happened, and pretend this was all just a friendly business reorganization. I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I handed the phone to my attorney, who'd been sitting at my kitchen table for the past hour, sipping coffee and reading the Wall Street Journal like we were discussing weekend fishing plans. She put the call on speaker and leaned forward. Her voice was calm, professional, almost bored. "Mr. Bradley, Defense Grid formally triggered Clause 15A as of Monday morning when they implemented the organizational restructuring. My client has zero interest in renegotiating the terms. We expect full contractual compliance within 30 days as specified." Silence on the other end. Then a long breath. "Well," Owen said, his voice quieter now, "perhaps we moved a little too quickly on some of the organizational changes. Maybe we could revisit the board's decision." "No," she cut him off. Clause 15A includes board-approved structural modifications. The changes have been documented, filed, and made official. Your only option at this point is compliance with the original agreement. More silence. No small talk this time. After a moment, he hung up politely but without making any promises. I looked over at my attorney. She raised an eyebrow and went back to her newspaper. There wasn't anything left to negotiate. No wiggle room, no clever legal maneuvering, no corporate shell games. They wanted to postpone the inevitable. I wanted it resolved. When you spend 12 years building the infrastructure that keeps a company running, people forget that you know where every critical component is located. And when they try to bury you under the system you created, it's only fair to take the blueprint with you. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to Wednesday morning, because that's when things got really interesting. 9:11 a.m. a message popped up in Defense Grid's legal team Slack channel that nobody wanted to see. Reviewing Clause 15A again. Check line 42 of the executive agreement. The acceleration language might include Q3 contract valuations. The message came from Zoe Martinez, a junior associate barely 18 months out of law school. She wasn't even supposed to be reviewing executive contracts that week, but she had a reputation for reading everything that crossed her desk twice. And she'd found the sentence they'd all missed. Buried in the middle of Clause 15A, sandwiched between two routine paragraphs about stock vesting schedules, was the trigger phrase. Equity acceleration calculated at highest recorded contract valuation occurring within active Pentagon deployment quarters. Defense Grid was smack in the middle of implementing the largest contract in company history, a $28 million classified network hardening project tied directly to national infrastructure security. We were 2 weeks into deployment. Performance bonuses, company valuation boosts, government oversight ratings, all of it wrapped into Q3 financial reporting. That single sentence had just transformed my departure from a routine corporate reshuffling into a financial detonation. My equity package, safely tucked away under Class B deferred shares for over a decade, had suddenly exploded in value. $8.5 million calculated against the current peak valuation that Logan himself had been bragging about in investor updates and board presentations. And because they'd triggered Clause 15A during an active deployment quarter, they owed me the full amount within 30 calendar days. No installments, no deferrals, no creative accounting tricks. Cash money, There was no escape hatch in the language, no arbitration clauses, no fine print loopholes, no corporate restructuring games. They'd built their entire Q3 financial success on the network architecture I'd designed, the security protocols I'd implemented, the vendor relationships I'd maintained, and the Pentagon connections I'd cultivated over 12 years of quiet, professional competence. They'd tried to extract me from the system like a defective component and forgotten that I wasn't just part of the infrastructure, I was the power source. Word of the discovery spread through Defense Grid like a virus. I wasn't in the loop for most of the internal panic, but I had friends throughout the company who kept me informed. Someone from the finance department called a buddy of mine that afternoon and asked off the record whether I might be willing to settle for 60 cents on the dollar. My friend just laughed. "You obviously don't know Mac very well," she told him. Preston, meanwhile, was still completely lost in the technical wilderness. His biggest concern seemed to be that someone had reorganized the AWS management console and he couldn't find the right dashboard configurations. I heard from one of our network engineers that Preston spent most of Wednesday building a PowerPoint presentation called Modernizing Legacy IT Operations, like giving the problem a fresh corporate buzzword might somehow solve it. Logan had gone into complete communications blackout, radio silent. The kind of profound quiet you only hear when someone realizes they've made a mistake so catastrophic that any attempt to fix it will only make things worse. The board had already rubber-stamped the organizational changes. It was public record now, filed with HR, shared with Pentagon contract oversight, distributed to key stakeholders. A done deal that couldn't be undone without admitting they'd screwed up the entire process. They'd fired the trigger on their little management reorganization without bothering to check whether it was connected to a financial explosive device. And now they had less than 30 days to explain to their investors, Pentagon liaisons, and company shareholders why they owed me more than $8 million because they'd wanted me to train someone who probably needed help logging into his email account. The money hit my account on a Thursday. No fanfare, no phone call, no congratulatory email. Just a quiet electronic transfer notification that popped up on my banking app while I was having morning coffee with my wife. $8,500,000.00 plus $75,000 in late payment penalties because they'd tried to drag it out right up until day 29 of their 30-day deadline. The memo line read, "Executive equity settlement per clause 15A. Nothing else. No acknowledgement. No apology from Logan. No admission of what they'd actually done. Just cold numbers and digital silence, exactly the way I designed it." I stared at the notification for about 30 seconds, then showed it to my wife. She looked at the screen, looked at me, then went back to her crossword puzzle like we'd just won a church raffle instead of the corporate lottery. "So what now?" she asked, without looking up. "Now I've finished my coffee," I said. "Then maybe I'll finally fix that leaky faucet you've been asking about for 6 months. She smiled at that. 23 years of marriage, and she still knew me better than I knew myself sometimes. At Defense Grid, they put out a corporate communication that afternoon. Standard sanitized business language, all polished and vague, dancing around the truth without actually lying about it. Preston was being transitioned to a strategic consulting role focused on external partnerships. Logan was stepping back from day-to-day operations to concentrate on investor relations and capital development opportunities. Nobody used the word demotion, but everybody understood. And buried deep in the Q3 financial disclosures, on page 47, line 7C, sub-bullet 2, right after a section about forward-looking statements and liquidity management, was one sentence. "Executive equity acceleration executed pursuant to clause 15A as previously disclosed." That was it. No headlines, no industry articles, no public embarrassment. But that's the thing about infrastructure work. It doesn't need spotlights and press releases. It just needs to hold when everything else falls apart. Every system I built over 12 years was still running. Every security protocol I'd implemented was still protecting their Pentagon contracts. The network architecture I'd designed back in 2016 was still the foundation of their entire operation. They hadn't just fired an employee, they'd built their future success on the technical framework I'd left behind. And every morning, Preston walked into an office wired for systems he didn't understand, using tools he hadn't earned, performing in a role that existed mainly on organizational charts. He'd won the title, but the infrastructure still responded to the voice that created it. 3 weeks after the settlement, I got a call from a Pentagon procurement officer I'd worked with for years. They were looking for an independent consultant to review cybersecurity protocols for a new $45 million defense network upgrade. Someone with experience in both military systems and private sector implementation. Someone they could trust. Interested? He asked. I looked out my workshop window at the garden. My wife had been planting for years, but never had time to plant because I was always working late, fixing other people's technical problems. Let me think about it, I said. I'll get back to you next week, but I already knew the answer. 2 months later, I was sitting in a congressional hearing room in Washington, testifying as an expert witness about cybersecurity vulnerabilities in defense contractor networks. The hearing had been triggered by a data breach at a major Pentagon supplier, not DefenseGrid, but a competitor who'd made the same mistake Logan did, prioritizing MBA credentials over technical competence. In your professional opinion, the committee chairman asked me, what's the most critical factor in maintaining secure defense networks? I adjusted the microphone and looked out at the room full of senators, Pentagon officials, and industry representatives. In the back, taking notes, I spotted a journalist from Defense Week magazine, Continuity. I said, you can't secure what you don't understand, and you can't understand systems you didn't build. The biggest vulnerability in any network isn't technical. It's organizational. When you replace institutional knowledge with organizational politics, you create security gaps that can take years to identify and fix. The chairman nodded and made a note. And in your experience, how common is this type of organizational vulnerability in the defense contracting sector? I thought about Logan, about Preston, about all the other companies making the same mistakes right now while convinced they were modernizing and streamlining. More common than anyone wants to admit, I said, that testimony became part of the official congressional record. It got quoted in trade publications, referenced in Pentagon procurement guidelines, and cited in academic papers about cybersecurity management. My name was attached to it permanently. 6 months after that, I had consulting contracts with 4 different defense agencies, a teaching position at the Naval War College, and a book deal to write about cybersecurity leadership in the modern defense industry. Logan's company, meanwhile, was struggling with system outages, vendor relationship problems, and Pentagon contract reviews. Nothing catastrophic, nothing that made headlines. Just the slow degradation that happens when you remove the foundation and expect the building to keep standing. Preston lasted another 8 months before quietly leaving for a strategic leadership opportunity at his father's consulting firm. Logan sold DefenseGrid to a larger defense contractor 18 months later at about 60% of what it would have been worth if they'd kept their technical leadership intact. I didn't gloat about any of it, didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. These days, I spend my mornings in the workshop, fine-tuning ham radio equipment and reading technical journals. Afternoons are for consulting calls with Pentagon officials who actually listen when I explain how network security really works. Evenings are for dinner with my wife, who finally got her garden planted and tells me I seem more relaxed than I've been in years. She's right. Turns out there's something deeply satisfying about building systems for people who understand their value, instead of trying to explain technical complexity to business majors who think expertise is something you can download from LinkedIn Learning. I'd built the perfect revenge, not out of anger, but out of structure. Not to destroy what I'd created, but to prove that some foundations are too important to tamper with. Because here's the thing about infrastructure work that business schools don't teach. You don't always see the foundation until someone tries to dig it out. And when they do, they discover that what they thought was just another employee was actually the load-bearing wall holding up everything they'd built their success on. Logan learned that lesson the expensive way. Preston learned it the humiliating way. Me? I just learned to charge what I'm actually worth. In the military, we had a saying, never leave a man behind. In corporate America, I learned the corollary. Never leave without your parachute packed. The difference between loyalty and stupidity is about 12 years of quiet preparation. They thought they were buying my silence with a severance package. Instead, they bought me the freedom to speak the truth about what really matters in this business. Competence over connections, preparation over politics, and the simple fact that respect isn't given, it's built one secure system at a time.